north of New York City in the beautiful Hudson Valley. And today what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about presidential history, how the Presidential Library came to be, the kinds of things that we do here, and then we're going to share some of the kind of cool documents that we have in our collection. And then what we'll do is at the end we'll open it up to some questions and answers. You supply the questions, I'll supply the answers. And so let's get started. The concept of presidential libraries actually began with none other than George Washington, our nation's first president. And as we all know, there had never been a president of the United States before, and so we spent 8 years in the Revolution fighting the British, thousands of lives lost, millions of dollars, and now we were our own independent country. And we better make it work, because if we didn't make it work, the British would be back, and you know they would probably hang all the founding fathers, and they would subjugate us back into being colonies again. Nobody understood this more than George Washington. And when he was elected to be our first president, he said, we have to make this work. Now, he wasn't so worried about himself because he had been a big shot landowner back in Virginia. He had been head of the Continental Congress. He had been head of the Continental Army, and he knew how to get stuff done. But he was afraid that the people who followed him in office might not be so easy to pick up the job and run with it. So what he decided to do was, he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make all of my papers available to future presidents. That way, the guys that follow me in office can see how I did the job, what I did, how I did it, who I talked to, who I worked with, and they'll get an idea right out of the gate on how to do this job. It's kind of like when you guys have got an older brother or sister who maybe has the teacher that you have now. Maybe they had them a couple of years ago. So you ask your brother, hey Bill, what's Mrs. McGillicuddy like? Is she funny? Does she give a lot of tests? Is there a lot of homework? And you want to get a sense of what it's going to be like in the class before you get there, so you can get prepared. And that's what Washington wanted to do for these future presidents. So he packs up all of his charts and graphs and letters and memos and reports, and he goes back to Mount Vernon, where he wants to organize his papers. But before he has a chance to get all of his papers organized, he dies. And in fact, many of George Washington's papers were destroyed. How do you think, any ideas how they might have been destroyed? Let's see. Somebody give me a guess.
Burned.
By what?
Burned.
Burned? You mean fire?
Yeah.
That is the number one wrong answer. So if you have to give a wrong answer, that's the right answer to give, even though it's wrong. They weren't burned. As a matter of fact, many of Washington's papers ended up looking like this, and it wasn't fire that did it, it was rats. Yeah, George Washington was a fancy guy, and he wrote on fancy paper. And the paper was very, very tasty for rats, so they couldn't help themselves, right? If I wrote you a note on a pizza, do you think you'd read the note, or would you eat the pizza? You'd eat the pizza, I know. So listen, it's not just young historians who are hungry for history, it's rats also. Well, what happened was the concept of the presidential library died along with that. And so from President Washington all the way up to President Roosevelt, we've lost a lot of our presidential history. Sometimes it was placed in wet, damp basements, which are not good conditions for papers. Sometimes they were placed in hot, dry attics where they became dusty and brittle and deteriorated. Sometimes if a presidential signature was on a document, it might just be cut off, sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. There's even reports that Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, burned a lot of Abraham Lincoln's papers. Yeah, Robert Todd Lincoln became a big shot in the Pullman Railroad Company, and of course, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. It was kind of uncool to have a parent that was born in a log cabin. You think your parents are embarrassing. Imagine having your parents be born in a log cabin, right? And then all your friends find that out. So what he did was he tried to destroy a lot of those documents. So along comes Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt says, all right, I just got us through the Great Depression, this major time in American history, and historians are going to want to know how I got through this. So I am going to make my papers available to future historians and future presidents so they can see how we got through this. So he phones up the Library of Congress and he says, hey, you guys want my papers? And what happens is the Library of Congress says, well, how many do you have? And he tells them how many he has, and they say, we don't have room for all that. We'll take a couple of these, a few of those, one of those, a couple of them. And Roosevelt says, no, you take everything or you take nothing. So the Library of Congress says, okay, we'll take nothing. Now, how many documents does Franklin Roosevelt have in his presidential library? Well, he happens to have about 17.5 million pages of documents. All right. Now, put your mind around that, right? How do you do that? Well, let's take a look. You're probably all familiar with the Washington Monument. All right, you all seen this somewhere before, right? In Washington, D.C. If you haven't been there, maybe you've seen pictures of it. Well, if you put all our papers on top of each other, we would have a stack not as tall as one Washington Monument, not as tall as two Washington monuments, but we would have a stack as tall as 16 Washington monuments. Right, that's how many documents we have in our collection. And if you look closely, you might be able to see the Capitol dome back there. Oh, wait a minute. It's not the Capitol. It's me. Never mind. Okay, so the idea here is we've got all kinds of documentation if you're looking for material on the Roosevelts. So where do we put all this stuff? Well, Franklin Roosevelt took a yellow piece of legal pad just like this, and he sketched out what he wanted his presidential library to look like. And he wanted it to look like this. Down here are his initials, FDR, April 12th, 1937. So he wants his library to look like this. It's got a large sloping roof, built around a nice porch, 6/6 windows, 12/12 windows, and made of Dutchess County fieldstone. So he gives this sketch over to an architect who then creates this building. And this is what the presidential library looks like here at the Roosevelt time. It's got the large sloping roof. It's got the 6/6 windows, 12/12 windows in the bottom, built around a nice inviting porch, and it's got the Dutchess County fieldstone on the outside. And it's such a beautiful day today here that you can actually hear the birds tweeting if you listen carefully. Spring has arrived in Dutchess County, boys and girls. So, quiet. So that is Franklin Roosevelt's presidential library. In this building, 17.5 million pages of documents, about 53,000 books. 23,000 of those belong to President Roosevelt himself. So how do we store these documents? Well, Franklin Roosevelt also developed the boxes by which he was going to store his documents. And this is an original box. If you look here, it says Democratic National Committee, 1932, Correspondence, 1928 to 1933. That's what it says there on the side. And this box was designed by Franklin Roosevelt himself. It would sit on a shelf like this. There's a little piece of like a ribbon here, and he could go through, pull the ribbon, the thing would slide off the shelf, and he would have it in his lap. Then what he could do is open it up, and you notice it makes like a little tray. Really, really important to a guy who's in a wheelchair, because if he drops the papers, he won't be able to get them down there. So he's got them here in the tray, and he's able to work with these things, and this is what's called a clamshell design. So when you close this down, see what it does? It closes out all the light. Okay, it closes out all the light. And that's really important, because one way you can destroy documents is to expose them to light. That's why you're not supposed to take photographs, flash photography in museums, because you think, well, it's only just that one little flash. But if that's repeated, thousands of times or millions of times, then what you end up with is a blank sheet of paper. It also has the metal reinforced corners, so when he was running around and he was going to bump into things, he wouldn't have to worry about that. So this is how they were originally stored. But now we have modern day Hollinger boxes, and this is what they look like today. They're much bigger, but you'll notice they have some of the same architectural design features that Roosevelt put in with his. Now instead of a ribbon, we have a string. So you pull the string, it slides off, and you've got this box now, and it's got the clamshell design again, so that when you shut it down, right, all the light gets shut out, and it's got the reinforced corners on the sides. So we have about 22,000 of these in our collection, and I want to show you a picture of what they look like when they are in their natural habitat. So that's what it looks like. Imagine a shelf that can hold, 17.5 million pages of documents from floor to ceiling. That's what these things are. Now, here's an interesting design flaw with some of these. See these boxes over here? These have got little holes in the hole at the bottom here, and that was so you could put your finger in and slide the box out. But we discovered that was letting light in, and so that's why we use the ones with the string, as we need to do. Now, if you want to know more about the Presidential Library System, you can learn it by looking at this chart, because this chart shows the Presidential Library System as it is today. And you can see I'm speaking to you from way over here in Hyde Park, New York, and some of the places you guys are. Let's see, you got the Carter Library kind of close to you in North Carolina out there, and Wisconsin. Well, let's see, probably closest to you would be Hoover. Not a whole lot of presidents from up in this area up here, but this shows you the Presidential Library System as it exists today. Now, the way this worked was this. Since Roosevelt was building this library to contain his own papers, he used privately raised money. So it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything to build a presidential library. He took his hat, passed it around, and he said, all right, pony up, give me some money here. And he raised $376,000 to build the presidential library. And then once it was built, it was handed over to the National Archives and Records Administration. And I can prove that because I've got this right here. This is a bronze medallion that came off a building when I hit it with a hammer. And what this is, I'm only kidding. That would be destruction of government property. But this is the National Archives. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and you've seen the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the